faith, where you kind of just stepped out and you weren't sure what was going to happen. And you said, just by faith, I'm going to step out, and took the soldiers rappelling down this 100-foot cliff. And so after we watched them do that, the commanding officer, he came to all the Boy Scouts who were kind of sitting there in a half circle, and he said, all right, how many of you would like to rappel down that cliff? And everybody's hands around me just shot up in the air. And before I could stop myself, my hand went up in the air too. And I didn't want to raise my hand, but the peer pressure, because I was completely afraid of heights. I wouldn't ride a Ferris wheel or anything like that. And so before I knew it, I was on top of this cliff, and there was a soldier standing in front of me, and he's hooking up me into the harness, and he's buckling everything together. And then he said, all right, walk over there. Next thing I know, I'm standing in front of this soldier with sunglasses on his face, and he's taking this rope and he's running it through the harness that's out on my body. And he said, all right, I want you to turn around. And he's a soldier, so what are you going to do? But like, yes, sir. And so I turned around, my back's to the cliff, and he said, now I want you to take one step backwards over the cliff. And I was like, what? And he kind of lowered his sunglasses and he looked me right in the eye and he said, I want you to trust me. And he said, he started to explain how the harness worked and how the ropes worked and all of that. And he said, this will hold up to 5,000 pounds. And he said to me, he said these words, I'll never forget them. The soldier looked at me and he said to me, he said, trust me, I will not let you fall. And I very slowly, very gingerly, because I was left with a choice. Either I was going to trust him or I wasn't. And so I quickly, or very slowly, gingerly stepped back over the cliff. It was the hardest step of faith I've ever taken in my life. And it was after you do, you know this, after you take that first step of faith, the other ones get a little bit easier after that. And finally, after I got down this 100-foot cliff, I was like, that was fun. And I wanted to do it again because I was willing to take that first step of faith. And that wasn't the only time I've ever had to take a step of faith in my life. There's been other times where I've kind of had to take that figurative step of faith, right? There's been times in my life where I've had to take the step of faith financially, or take the step of faith relationally, or take the step of faith emotionally or spiritually. And I don't think I'm too much unlike all of you here today as well, where maybe there's been times where you've received the diagnosis and you've had to take the step of faith. Where you've had the children who've walked away and you've had to take the step of faith. Or you've had a relationship that has dissolved and you've had to take the step of faith. And you're standing there and really this is what really clarifies a lot of things in our life is when we come to those quote unquote cliff moments in our life. Where are we going to lean? Where are we going to step? Who are we going to trust in that moment? Because the truth is, and you all know this, and I say this so many times to you in so many different contexts, but right, all of us at one point or another are going to have to take that step of faith. And maybe you're coming out of a cliff moment in your life where you've had to take a step of faith and you weren't sure how it was going to work out, but you did it and you saw your faith grow as a result of it. Or maybe right now, as you're sitting here, you're in the midst of a cliff moment in your life, and Jesus is asking you, hey, will you trust me in this? Will you take that first step of faith over the cliff and trust me in this? And if that's not the case, all of us in this room, at some point or another, either very future, all of us are going to be asked by Jesus to take a step of faith. And when we take that step of faith, what Jesus is asking us to do is simply this. This is the take-home truth today. He's just simply asking all of us to walk by faith. Just walk by faith. We've all heard that before. If you've been around church for any length of time, or maybe even not around church, you've heard that phrase before. Like sometimes we just got to walk by faith. And that idea of walking by faith is so important in our lives because all of us have encountered those people in our lives, right? Those people in our lives who very clearly walk by faith. Like they had those cliff moments in their life and you've watched them and the confidence they have is unmistakable. The joy that they have in their life as they walk through this with faith is unbreakable. The peace that they have throughout all of this is just unmistakable in their lives because you watch them and they walk by this series through John as we're looking at those signs that Jesus performed. John said the things that Jesus did were not just simply miracles, but they were signs. They were intended to show who Jesus was and help people to understand. The signs were there people to the fact that Jesus was who he said he was. And ultimately, these signs point us to that truth that we find in John chapter 14, verse 6, where Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. All of the signs that Jesus performed were ultimately designed to get people to believe in him. And as we look at this, I said this last week, as we look at these signs that Jesus performed in the Gospel of John, all of them end with someone believing in Jesus. Because it wasn't just about the sign, it was about who the sign pointed to. And last week we looked at that first sign where Jesus turned water into wine. It's the only one that rhymes. Remember that? Okay. So anyways, the first sign, Jesus turned water into wine. It's the only one that rhymes. And there we saw that Jesus makes all things new, including you. And how I encourage you at that moment to invite Jesus into your situation, to allow him to bring restoration to your situation, whatever it is that you're facing in your life. And there we saw the disciples, as they saw Jesus turn that water into wine, it says they saw the glory of God. The glory of God was revealed in that, and they believed in him. And that's the first sign. And actually what we're going to look at today is the second sign that John says Jesus performed. And what had happened is after that first sign in John chapter 2, Jesus left Galilee, which is in the northern part of Israel, and he traveled to Jerusalem. And when he was in Jerusalem, this is where we have the famous altercation and the famous conversation. Okay, the altercation happened when Jesus got to Jerusalem and he walks into the temple and all the people there, they're selling all of these things and they're trying to make a profit. And that's where he flips over all of the tables and he drives the money changers out. And he said, my father's house to be a house of prayer, and you have made it a den of thieves. That famous altercation. Then in John chapter 3, that's where we have the famous conversation, where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus at night. It was Nick at night. Those of you young enough or old enough to remember that. Okay, so at Nick at night, Jesus is having that conversation with Nicodemus, and that's where Jesus makes the famous statement to Nicodemus, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. And so everything kind of wraps up in Jerusalem, and Jesus is heading back north again to Galilee. And in John chapter 4, that's where he encounters the Samaritan woman at the well. And he explains to her about how he is the living water. And he traverses back through Samaria and comes back to the northern part of Israel, again, back to Galilee. And that's where we're going to pick it up this morning in John chapter 4, beginning actually in verse number 46. So Jesus has come back into the region of Galilee, the northern part of Israel. And here we're going to see Jesus' encounter with a man and how this man learned to walk by faith. And if you have a Bible that has headings in your Bible, you can probably read the heading there, and it explains to you everything that's going to happen and everything that we're about to read today. And it's the healing of the nobleman's son, or maybe you have one that says the healing of the royal official's son, but in any case, that's what happens here. And so we're going to look at this and see how this official saw the sign and how it pointed to Jesus, and how as a result of it, he began to walk by faith. So the first thing we see is the official's trouble. Like he had some trouble in his life. He was in the midst of a cliff moment in his life, a situation where he was going to be asked. It's going to be required of him just to simply trust Jesus at this moment in his life. And it starts in verse 46, and it says, therefore, he came again to Cana of Galilee. Now, when we read that, you're like, well, Cana of Galilee, that kind of sounds familiar. And John, as he was writing the Gospel of John, said, it probably should sound familiar to you, because if you've read what I've written thus far, he says, therefore he came to Cana of Galilee, where he had made water into wine. And you're like, oh, yeah, that was the first sign. He changed water into wine, and it's the only one that rhymes, okay? And so, yes, yeah, okay. So now we have context as to where Jesus is located. And it's good. And John went on, and there was a royal official whose son was sick at Capernaum. Now, Jesus says that this man was a royal official, which means that he worked for a king, he was part of the royal entourage, which meant that this was a man who was very powerful, he had a lot of influence, he was probably wealthy. And John said that this royal official's son was sick. And I can only imagine that if it's this man who's in this position in life, he probably had access to the best doctors around. He probably had access to the best medications that money could afford. And I can only assume that this royal official tried everything. He visited all the doctors. He got referrals to all the specialists. He got all the medications that he could get in order to treat his son so that his son could get better. But his son didn't seem to get better. And actually, as we continue to read on here, we discover that his son's condition actually worsens. Because John said in verse 47, when he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him. And so this, like, I've exhausted every option that I can think of, every option that money can afford, and it's just not working. And so now he comes to Jesus. And he heard that Jesus was in Cana of Galilee. And don't forget, the royal official had lived in Capernaum, which according to Matthew chapter 4 was Jesus' home base when he started his ministry. So this royal official had probably heard the things that Jesus had performed and maybe even witnessed some of the things that Jesus had done or heard some of the teachings that Jesus had given. And so he realized at this point, I've tried everything else. Now maybe my last option is to find this man Jesus, because I've heard about what he's done. I've maybe seen some things that he's done. Some people have told me about some things that he's done. So I've got to find him because he can probably help my son. And then in verse 47 went on. And so he found Jesus, he went to him and was imploring him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. He was imploring him. The way John wrote that in the original Greek language was the idea that he was begging and continued to beg. He just wouldn't stop. He was that person that just continued on and on and on. And he was asking, he was begging, he was pleading, he was imploring him. He was asking Jesus, Jesus, why don't you just come down to Capernaum? Come with me, because my son who is sick is now at the point of death. And I don't know where else to turn. I don't know, maybe you have been in those positions before, where you've tried everything else, or maybe you're a good Christian, and maybe when these things happen, Jesus is your first option, not your last resort. And you've come to this cliff moment in your life, you have trouble, and you just don't know where else to turn, and so you come to Jesus. I remember about 10 years ago, Beth was diagnosed with cancer. And she was at the doctor, and I remember sitting in the doctor's office and the doctor telling us that the tumor was malignant. And it just took both of us by surprise. She was a fairly young woman at the time. And so we left the doctor's office and we sat in the car, and through tears, because when you hear the word cancer, your mind goes all these places. And just sitting there in the car, we just prayed, because we were at this cliff moment in our lives. And we, at this point, were going to have to take a step of faith. And could it not be, and we're going to see this maybe even more clearly next week, but could it not be that Jesus brings us to those cliff moments in our life to actually grow our faith? Could it just be that the difficulties and the troubles and the dark moments in our life are not just happening by random, but there is a God behind it all who actually cares about you and says, I want to get you to the edge of the cliff because I want you to take that step of faith, and I want you just to trust me in this. Psalm chapter 119, verse 67, David wrote there, he said, "Before my affliction I went astray, but now I keep your word." There was David. He was saying, hey, before I experienced the trouble in my life, my heart was always going astray. I was continuing to do things in disobedience. But now when I faced the trouble in my life, it kind of hemmed me in. It helped me to learn to just simply walk by faith. So that's his trouble. But it goes on here, and we see next the official's test. You see, Jesus always wants to move us from a frail, fragile, feeble faith to a faith that is unmistakable and unbreakable and unshakable. And oftentimes, he will bring us to these cliff moments in our life to find out if we're going to lean into him or not, because it's these moments in our life, these pivotal circumstances in our life, where we learn if we're actually going to trust him or not. And Adrian Rogers, the famous pastor who died a number of years ago, he said this. He said, a faith that is not tested is a faith that cannot be trusted. And so here, Jesus brings this royal official to the edge of the cliff. And look at what it says in verse number 48. So Jesus said to him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe. Now, this man, he's come and he's fallen at Jesus' feet and he's begging and he's imploring and he's pleading with Jesus. And it's almost like Jesus pouring cold water on this man. And he says, what's the deal here? He says, unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe. Now, there have been many times where I've heard sermons on this passage of Scripture, and every time it comes to verse 48, I've always heard that Jesus' response here was a harsh criticism to the people. But when I read it, I don't see it as a harsh criticism so much as I see it as a tender encouragement to the people. Because look at what it says. It says that Jesus said to him, he said to the man, unless you people, in original Greek, it's third person plural. And so what Jesus looking at the man, he says, unless all y'all, right? A lot of people have gathered around Jesus here. And he says, unless yins guys see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe. So he may be talking directly to the man, but he's talking to him in such a way that he wants everyone standing there to hear. And if you go back to verse 44, before this account is written about, John wrote these words. He said, for Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his home country. And so that kind of sets the scene for about what's to happen here. And so I think it's a tender encouragement by Jesus because he realizes you're just probably not going to believe unless you see something. And I don't think it's a harsh criticism so much as it is a tender encouragement to the people. Listen, I understand it. Unless you all see signs, you won't believe. And that's John's whole point in this entire gospel is that Jesus performed these signs so that they would point to who Jesus was. I remember, and basically what Jesus is saying, he's saying to the people, don't get enamored with the signs. What I want you to see is to whom the signs point. A few weeks ago, we were at Penn State Altoona. We were watching a men's volleyball game, and I had to use the restroom. But I hadn't, the first time I'd ever been in the building there. And so I walked out of the concession stand. I asked the girl behind the concession stand, I said, where's the restrooms? And she pointed around the corner, and she said, just go around this corner. And then she said this, she said, and just follow the signs. And I came to the first sign that pointed to where the restrooms were. I didn't stop there and say, whoa, that is such a beautiful sign. No. I followed the sign and I ended up at the restroom, okay? Because that's what the sign is there for. And so I think what Jesus is saying here is saying, listen, guys, don't get enamored with the sign. What I want you to see is to whom the sign points. And I want you to see this, and I want you to believe in me. And we see the official's heart a little bit in the very next verse. In verse 49, the official said to him, sir, come down before my son dies. Like, I don't understand all the theology that you're talking about. All I'm asking you to do is really just two options is probably what's going on in the official's mind. Option number one, Jesus comes back with me to Capernaum and my son lives. Option two, Jesus doesn't come back to Capernaum with me and my son dies. I mean, when you read that, he's thinking those are the only two options that are available to me. So, sir, please come with me so that my child will not die. But Jesus says, oh, no, listen, You only see two options? Jesus says, no. I have a third option. Look at what it says in verse 50. Jesus said to him, go, your son lives. What do you mean? If you don't come, my son's going to die. If you come, my son will live. But Jesus said, no, here's the third option. You just go because your son lives. And the way it's written in the original language, this is fascinating to me. It's written in such a way where Jesus said, go and don't worry. Go and don't hurry. Just go about your business. Don't hurry, don't worry, because your son lives. And at this moment, this official is standing on the edge of the cliff, and Jesus has lowered his sunglasses, and he's looked at him in the eye, and he said, do you trust me? Because what I want you to do next is to take a step of faith and walk by faith. So what we see next is the official's trust. Because right now, the official is standing on the edge of the cliff. He has a choice to make. Either he's going to believe Jesus, he's going to trust him, or he's not. And so in the midst of this choice, where Jesus kind of gives him a third option, kind of outside of what he was expecting, look at what it says in verse 50. After Jesus said to him, go, your son lives, the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and started off. Like, I don't know if you need to read between the lines here, but it doesn't appear as though the official argued with Jesus. He didn't try to convince Jesus to come with him. Jesus said, no, here's the third option. You go, your son is going to live. And the official believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he started off. He started to do what? He took a step of faith and just started then to walk by faith. And then in verse 51, as he was now going down, his slaves met him, saying that his son was living. You see, your belief will impact your behavior, right? What you really believe is going to determine and impact how you are going to live. And what we see here in this man, he begins to walk by faith, and what he believed Jesus to say was true, he began to live it out in his life. And here's just let me say this. Oftentimes we hear people who are sick or people who things aren't going well with them, and other Christian people will say to them, you're just going to have more faith. And then if you're in the South, they say, brother, got to have more faith, brother, okay? Or if it's a sister, you got to have more faith, sister. Like these things aren't working out for you because you don't have enough faith. Faith is what moves us when it appears as though God is not moving. Faith does not always necessarily move God in the direction we want him to go, but faith will always move you and I when it appears as though God is not moving at all. And that's exactly what happened in this man's life. He just simply believed Jesus. He started off, and on his way, he didn't even get all the way home. And he encounters his slaves, and they met him and saying, your son was living. Verse 52. So he inquired of them the hour when he began to get better. Then they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. The most fascinating word in that entire verse, for me, is yesterday. 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 At the 7th hour, which would have been 1 p.m. Now, Capernaum was about 20 miles away from Cana, where Jesus was, where the royal official went. And again, he's a royal official. If he walked, a 20-mile walk would have been an entire day, but he probably didn't walk. He was a royal official, so he had a horse, he had a chariot to traverse those 20 miles. And according to my equine expert, Paula Rochelle, she told me that you can ride a horse 20 miles in 2 to 3 hours. Okay? So imagine this. He rides his horse, he meets Jesus. Jesus says at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, go, your son lives. Now his servants are telling him, hey, this happened yesterday at 1 o'clock. If it was at 1 o'clock when Jesus told him to go, it appears as though the royal official didn't head back home that day. He would have had more than enough time to make it home that day, but he stayed in Cana. Maybe he had some business to attend to there, but he believed Jesus enough. I don't have to hurry. I don't have to worry. And it wasn't until the next day that he went home. And his servants tell him it all happened in the 7th hour when the fever left him. And then John went on and he said in verse 53, so the Father knew that it was at that hour in which Jesus said to him, your son lives. Like, I imagine he gets a chill that runs down his spine, and maybe tears begin to fill up in his eyes, and he looks back in the direction of Cana and remembers that it was at that moment that Jesus told me to go because my son lives. And he probably, dug the spurs into the side of his horse, or he told the person who driving his chariot, let's go. And in a cloud of dust, he headed back home to Capernaum. And in verse 53, he continued, and he himself believed, and his whole household. So he gets home and he hugs his son who is now well, and he begins to relay the story and the events that just transpired in his life over the last 2 or maybe even 3 days. And he said, let me just tell you what happened. And then Jesus performed this sign. Believed. They saw to whom the sign pointed, and they believed. And John, again, gives some commentary at the end, and he says, this is, again, a second sign that Jesus performed when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. So, as we walk by faith, because all of that is true, what should we do? Because in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, it tells us there, we walk by faith, not by sight. It's exactly what we saw in this official's life. And many times we come to the scriptures and we read them so that we can be comforted or we could be encouraged. But ultimately, Jesus' words in the scripture is here to really change our lives so that we would believe, and our belief would change our behavior. Because it's so easy for us just to be religious, right? It's so easy just to attend church. It's so easy just to go through all the religious trappings, but it's much more difficult to actually walk by faith. So how do we do that? Or what should we do in light of that? And I want to encourage you to do this. Just live like God is telling the truth. That's what it means to walk by faith. It just simply means I'm going to live like God is telling the truth. Financially, I'm going to live like God is telling the truth. Relationally, I'm going to live like God is telling the truth. Emotionally, I'm going to live like God is telling the truth. Whatever area of my life, wherever I find myself in the cliff moments of life, I'm just going to live like God is telling the truth. So as I kind of wrap up, let me just kind of give you some handles on how to do that. How do we live like God is telling the truth? Number one is believe even when you do not see. And the royal official, he didn't see his son, John was okay, but he believed even when he did not see. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 tells us this: "If faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen." We walk by faith, not by sight. When we live like God is telling the truth, it means I'm believe the truth even when I cannot see the evidence. Secondly, it means that I'm going to obey even when I do not understand. When I walk by faith, when you live like God is telling the truth, it means you obey even when you do not understand. The royal official said, I don't understand. I had 2 options here. Jesus gave me a third option. I don't understand how he's going to do this, but you know what? I'm just going to obey and I'm going to go. Like every time I get into my car, in order to start my car, they tell me I got to put the key in and turn the ignition. I have no idea. I don't understand how an internal combustion engine works, but I do my part, and I just trust that the engine's going to do its part. I don't understand. And there's a lot of things in our life that we don't necessarily understand, but it doesn't mean that we do not obey. So let me just ask you, what step of faith is God asking you to take today, and what's keeping you from taking that step of faith? Just simply obey even when you don't understand. And then thirdly, persevere even when you do not want. Like this royal official, these events took place over 2, maybe 3 days. Do you think ever during those 2 to 3 days, the royal official ever got discouraged? Like he was begging and begging and begging Jesus to come. Do you think the royal official ever thought this is just a waste of time? You ever think the royal official said, I'm just so tired? I mean, he was riding on dirty, dusty roads. It was probably hot. You ever think he just got tired and just wanted to quit? No, he persevered even when he didn't want to, even when he just kept going, even when he didn't want to keep on going. So live like God is telling the truth. Because your belief will impact your behavior. Because listen, when you face those cliff moments in life, you don't know what or who hangs in the balance. When you encounter those cliff moments in your life and you've got to walk by faith, you don't know who is watching you. You don't know who is about ready to put their faith in Jesus because of your walking by faith. You don't know who you're going to impact because of your willingness to walk by faith. So walk by faith and just simply live like God is telling the truth. And you, as you're going to hear in a moment, you are going to be glad that you did. Now, I want to wrap up today, and I'm going to ask Kaylin Garcia to come, and she's going to share her testimony, some things that have transpired in her life and how she, through all of that, just continued to walk by faith. So, Kaylin, come on.
Good morning. For those of you who might not know me, like Pastor Ashley said, my name's Kaylin Garcia. I'm married to my loving husband, Comanche. Most people only know me through him, so I always have to throw that out there. We have a beautiful 8-year-old daughter, Charlie, and we've been coming to Hillside since Charlie was in the nursery. I have the most supportive parents in the entire world. I'm going to share my faith story after hiding something in my life for so long. I know that I'm not alone in my struggles, and I'm here to tell you today that you aren't alone either. At the end of this, I'm going to play a song called God is in This Story. All the people I just named are in my story, but most importantly, God is in mine too. I have been diagnosed with health anxiety and death anxiety. It started a couple years ago, but recently took over my life last summer. I have had so many panic attacks that I quit counting them. I've not only had them at home, but I've had them in the school pickup line, the grocery store, on days without sleeping, in fear that I would die in my sleep. Every single ache or pain that I would feel, or if I had the common cold, I immediately thought that I was going to die. I would constantly Google my symptoms and immediately spiral out of control and would contact my doctor over and over to be seen. I would check my oxygen and my heart rate no less than 30 times a day. I would count my breaths every hour and would shake in fear if I was above or below the average number. I wouldn't leave my house in fear of having something medically happen to me while I was out. I would make sure that my house was spotless, laundry was done, and all things for my husband and daughter were taken care of just in case I died that day. I would call my parents all hours of the day or in the middle of the night, just crying, not saying a word because I couldn't breathe. I would beg my husband to take me to the emergency room because I knew this was it. I was going to die that day. I would sit at my kitchen table for hours upon hours and just cry. I begged my doctors to send me to specialist after specialist. I have worn a 24-hour heart monitor, a 10-day heart monitor. I did a stress test. I had an echocardiogram, and I had a sleep study done. I also begged to get my blood tested monthly, and I'm only 33 years old. I got so bad that my doctor started to see me every 2 weeks. I would make her listen to my heart and my lungs over and over. I would cry so hard and would start to panic right in front of her in her office. Even when leaving the doctor's office and she told me that I was fine, I would sit in my car in the parking lot and have a panic attack that she was wrong and something was not right. I have had friends come over to my house to check my blood pressure. I would send pictures to my friends to see if I had blood clots, and I would have my parents spend the night with me countless nights because I didn't want to be alone while my husband was working third shift. I would make my husband use many of his personal days at work just to be home with me at night. I then practically begged him to change his shift at work so he could be home during my worst times, which was at night. I would disrupt my family and my friends while they were sleeping. If my husband was off, I would still be worried and would end up keeping him and my daughter wide awake all hours of the night because I didn't want to be alone at all and would just cling beside them. I knew that my husband, my daughter, my family, and my friends didn't deserve this broken version of me, and I knew that I didn't deserve this broken version of me. My mom would constantly say that I was under attack by the enemy, but I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to believe that it was Sunday, and it just so happened that on my Sundays to teach, I would wake up thinking I was having a heart attack, a stroke, or something else was wrong because I had every single symptom. It just didn't make sense to me that it could be the enemy because I teach vacation Bible school. I've also taught the bigger kids. So I would continue calling my parents when I was home alone when the attacks were happening. My mom reassured me that I was under attack by the enemy, that if I was working hard for God, Satan was going to try and work harder to bring me down. A friend that I knew was battling these anxieties and attacks sent me a quote not long after my mom continued to tell me it was Satan coming after me and getting bolder in God. The quote said, "Satan wouldn't be attacking you so persistently if there wasn't something of value inside of you. Thieves don't break into empty houses." That night, I had multiple panic attacks back to back to back. I couldn't breathe, but made it to the spare room to call my parents so my husband and daughter wouldn't see how bad I actually was. When I called, they began to pray so hard for me over the phone, and I was just crying and crying. My mom then shouted, "The devil does not want to mess with me or my daughter," and she rebuked him for me and told him to flee. All of a sudden, my tears turned to a smile that I have not truthfully felt since the year 2021. After our conversation, I went downstairs to do laundry, trying to keep my mind busy. When I was doing this, I was continuing the prayer that my parents had started. I was asking Jesus to help me, guide me, show me just how near he was to me. There is a poster on our basement wall that I usually never look at, but for some reason on this night while I was praying, I dropped a sock, looked up, and the poster read, "A fresh new start." Again, I smiled, another real smile that I have not felt in so long. I knew that Jesus was going to help me and give me a fresh new start. But why didn't I rely on him at the beginning of this? Why did I only use my own strength? To this day, I truthfully don't know. I was raised in such strong Christian faith and am now raising my daughter in the same faith, so why wasn't I using mine? In the beginning of my healing, there were times where I couldn't even pray. I would just listen to songs worshiping God and just cry. But I knew the Holy Spirit was in me and was doing the praying for me that I needed. I started doing one devotion book, then I started doing another. I was able to do these devotions, pray, and still listen to songs. So I started doing online sermons and more devotions. I started to read the book of Psalm, one chapter a day. I started doing prayer journals and a daily devotion with a close friend. I would still come under attack often. I would find myself in the middle of the night, wide awake, crying out to God, saying, "God, help me. I can't do this anymore. I just can't do this. Please." I knew my healing wouldn't happen right away, but I never doubted him because the Bible says to be still. I was learning how to fight back and use God's strength. I learned that fear and anxiety are not from God. God only wants us to be filled with joy and peace. So I learned to fight Satan, knowing that when I do, he has to flee. Right now, I'm doing so many devotions and prayer journals a day that instead of using the spare room for hiding and crying, I now use it to store all of them in. I recently hosted 2 online devotion groups with people that I know who also battle fear and anxiety. One of these groups are high school friends of mine. We decided to keep the group going after the devotion series was over, and now every single day we're praying for each other and building each other up. Now I can't even think about cleaning or doing laundry until I praise and worship him. I now fall asleep at night with no problems because I look forward to the next day's devotions. I now love to go outside and spend time with friends because I've learned to give him thanks for all that I have, see, and do. My prayers started out being just about me, but now I find myself praying more for others. I find myself sharing his word to others and will hear their name in my head over and over, and I know that I need to pray for them. I've also learned to pray and give thanks, thanking him for my daily victories, listing them one by one. I've learned that if you fight all of your battles surrendered to God, you will win every single time. I still have my days where I can feel my heart starting to race and my breath gets short, but I now know to say no. The devil has no control over me, and I have victory in Jesus' name. I learned to read Luke chapter 10, verse 19, as it reassures me that nothing can harm me. I learned to read Psalms 27 over and over just to remember that I have nothing to fear. I've learned by reading Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 18, that I can put on the full armor of God to stand my ground. I've learned in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 to 10, that it's okay to not be okay, and that what the enemy means for evil, God will use for good. I've learned by reading 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 to 10, to cast all of my anxieties, and trust me, it's really hard to do, on God because I know that he cares for me and is making me stronger throughout all of this. The hardest but most amazing thing that I've learned is in James chapter 1, verse 2, that whatever trial I face, I need to consider it pure joy because the testing of my faith produces perseverance, that God has promised to strengthen me and bring me closer to him. Throughout all of this, I've learned that doctors are great. My doctors have all been wonderful. They've all listened to me. They've never, ever dismissed me. Going to therapy is great. I have a therapist that I go to weekly that makes me journal, which I'm very thankful for because I can see how far I've really come. Being medicated is absolutely fine. Relying on others is absolutely fine. And I even relied on my dogs and my cat, which is absolutely fine. But I will tell you that there is no peace quite like I have found in Jesus. I wish I could explain it more, how filled I am with joy, peace, and comfort, but I know I would never be able to. All I can do is share his love and be the light that others may need. I promise you that no matter what situation you may be going through, God will give you strength. Sharing this today was something I knew I always wanted to do, but I didn't know when it would happen because I felt like I would be under the control of anxiety forever, but here I am. Looking back at my first ever prayer journal, here is what I wrote on my very first day. Lord, I pray that I overcome my anxiety and all panic. Any negative, fearful, or anxious thoughts, I pray it leaves me. I pray that you soothe my troubled heart. Lord, I am so scared. I'm so tired of my anxiety, my panic attacks, and my fear. I know with you I don't need to be, but I pray that my trust becomes so strong and that my heart and mind are healed. I pray that I am healed to become a testimony for others, to share my faith story and shine a bright light. So just as I said in the beginning, God is in my story, and I pray that he's in yours too.